Max Harper, a successful civil rights lawyer, boards a flight expecting a peaceful journey until he's wrongfully accused by a fellow passenger whose fear spirals out of control. What starts as quiet suspicion turns into a public confrontation that tests Max's composure and leaves everyone on edge. Will prejudice win, or will dignity and patience prevail? Join us for a gripping story about fear, judgment, and resilience. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment. How would you handle being in Max's position? Let's find out what happens next. Max Harper strode through the bustling terminal of JFK International Airport, his sharp suit slightly rumpled from a day filled with meetings. He was exhausted, but the end was in sight. A flight to Los Angeles would be a chance for him to reset and prepare for the important conference awaiting him on the West Coast. As a well-known civil rights lawyer, Max had grown accustomed to traveling for speaking engagements, and this particular conference was especially significant. A major platform to speak about the progress made in social justice, as well as the work still left to do. The usual travel chaos buzzed around him, travelers scrambling to make their flights, gate agents repeating boarding calls, and children tugging at the hands of weary parents. Max glanced at the departure board, confirming his flight number, 287, before making his way toward the gate. All he wanted was a quiet, uneventful flight, a bit of time to unwind with the novel tucked in his carry-on. As he approached the gate, a sense of tension washed over him. Not the kind of tension that most passengers felt when preparing to board, but something more visceral, something that had become familiar to him over the years. A kind of awareness that came with being a black man, even one in a suit, walking through crowded, predominantly white spaces. He glanced around, catching a few sidelong glances from other passengers, but he kept moving, used to the attention. He was a man with a purpose, and today that purpose was to make it to his seat without any trouble. Across the gate area, Samantha Price sat nervously, her eyes darting between her phone and the gate. She clutched her handbag tightly, feeling the usual wave of anxiety wash over her as she prepared to board the plane. Flying had never been easy for her, but in recent years it had become downright terrifying. With all the news stories about violence and danger, she couldn't help but feel on edge every time she stepped into an airport. Her husband Ethan sat next to her, flipping through a magazine and trying to stay relaxed. He had seen Samantha like this before, on edge, scanning her surroundings like she was waiting for something bad to happen. He wished she could just let it go, just this once, and enjoy the flight. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. Samantha forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, you know how I get before flights." Ethan nodded, understanding but weary. "It's going to be fine, Sam. We'll be in LA before you know it, and you can relax." But Samantha couldn't relax. Not yet. As she glanced around the gate area, her eyes landed on Max. He was tall, well-dressed, with a confident air about him, but something about him made her uneasy. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he seemed so calm. Too calm. Or maybe it was because of everything she'd seen on the news lately. Bad things always seem to happen when you least expected them. She nudged Ethan gently. "Did you see that man?" Ethan looked up from his magazine, following her gaze to Max, who was now standing near the boarding line. "What about him?" Samantha hesitated. "I don't know. There's just something about him. I don't like it." Ethan sighed, recognizing the familiar tone of anxiety creeping into her voice. "Sam, he's just another passenger. Don't start working yourself up over nothing." But Samantha couldn't help it. As Max stood waiting to board, she felt the tension in her chest grow. Maybe it was just her imagination, but something about him made her feel uneasy. The gate agent called for boarding, and the terminal came alive with movement. Max stood, pulling the strap of his bag over his shoulder as he moved toward the gate. He passed by Samantha and Ethan on his way, and though the encounter was brief, he could feel her eyes on him, watching him intently. He was used to this kind of scrutiny. Throughout his career, Max had developed a thick skin when it came to being judged or second-guessed based on his appearance. It wasn't something he liked to dwell on, but it was a reality he had learned to navigate, both in his personal life and his professional one. As he handed his ticket to the agent and made his way down the jet bridge, Max allowed himself a moment to breathe. Soon, he'd be in his seat, the world outside fading away for a few hours, and he could decompress with the book he'd been meaning to finish. Samantha and Ethan followed behind him, and as they stepped onto the plane, Samantha's unease grew. The plane felt cramped, the narrow aisle crowded with passengers tucking bags into the overhead compartments and jostling for space. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they made their way to their seats a few rows behind Max, she kept glancing at him, her anxiety building. Max reached his seat near the emergency exit and stowed his bag beneath the seat in front of him. He sat down, grateful to have a little extra legroom and a quiet spot by the window. He took out his book, eager to lose himself in the story and forget about the stresses of the past week. But Samantha wasn't so easily distracted. She kept her eyes on Max as he settled into his seat, her mind racing with possibilities. He seemed so calm, so composed, but wasn't that how dangerous people often appeared before they did something terrible? Ethan noticed her fidgeting and leaned in closer. "What is it now?" Samantha lowered her voice. "It's him? The guy by the emergency exit." Ethan sighed again. "Sam, he's just sitting there. Stop worrying." But Samantha couldn't stop. She had seen too many stories on the news about people who seemed normal until they weren't, about those who slipped through security unnoticed. She couldn't help but feel like something was off about the man sitting near the exit. She watched him intently as he pulled out his book and began to read, her anxiety creeping higher with every passing minute. The plane took off smoothly, the engines roaring as it lifted into the sky. Max glanced out the window, watching the clouds roll by as the city below grew smaller. He had always enjoyed flying, finding it peaceful, especially after long weeks of work. There was something about being above the world, disconnected from everything, that gave him a sense of freedom. He settled back into his seat, turning his attention to the book in his hands. It was a gripping legal thriller, the kind of story he could lose himself in for hours. But as he began to read, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Samantha's eyes were fixed on Max. She couldn't stop watching him. Every time he moved, whether to adjust his seatbelt or reach for his bag, her heart raced. She was convinced that he was up to something. What exactly? She didn't know. But her anxiety had a life of its own, feeding off every small action he made. At one point, Max leaned down to unzip his carry-on, retrieving a small bottle of water. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as he carefully placed the bottle on his tray table and took a sip. Ethan noticed the tension in her body. "Sam, come on. You're stressing yourself out for no reason." But Samantha wasn't listening. "Why does he keep checking his bag? It's suspicious." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "He's just getting a drink. You do that too, you know." But to Samantha, it wasn't normal. He was too deliberate, too calm. It reminded her of the stories she had seen on the news. Stories of people who had hidden their intentions until it was too late. Her chest tightened as she watched Max place the water bottle back in his bag and zip it up. "I'm telling you, something's wrong," Samantha whispered. "I think we should say something." Ethan sighed, exasperated. "Say what? That a guy had a drink of water? Will sound crazy." But Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "It's better to be safe than sorry," she muttered, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "I'm going to talk to the flight attendant." Samantha raised her hand, catching the attention of the flight attendant, Rachel Burke, as she passed by. Rachel, a calm and experienced flight attendant in her early 30s, approached with a polite smile. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Rachel asked, her tone friendly but professional. Samantha hesitated, glancing toward Max before leaning closer to Rachel. "That man," she whispered, nodding in Max's direction. "The one near the emergency exit." I think he's acting suspicious. Rachel's expression remained neutral, though she followed Samantha's gaze toward Max, who was now flipping through his book, seemingly unaware of the attention he was receiving. "What do you mean by suspicious?" Rachel asked, keeping her voice low. Samantha bit her lip, unsure how to explain her anxiety without sounding paranoid. "I don't know. It's just the way he keeps checking his bag. It feels off. I think he might be hiding something." Rachel smiled gently, sensing the anxiety in Samantha's voice. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but I can assure you that everyone on this flight went through security screening before boarding. If there were any issues, they would have been caught." Samantha frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. "But don't you think it's better to be safe? What if there's something dangerous in that bag?" Rachel kept her smile in place, her professional training kicking in. She had dealt with anxious passengers before, and she knew how to de-escalate situations like this. "Ma'am, I understand you're worried, but unless there's something specific you've seen that indicates a threat, we can't search another passenger's belongings without cause. Is there anything else you've noticed?" Samantha hesitated, knowing she didn't have anything concrete to report. But the feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. "No, I guess not." Rachel nodded, maintaining her calm demeanor. "I'll keep an eye on things, but please try to relax. We want everyone on board to feel safe and comfortable." Samantha nodded reluctantly, though she didn't feel reassured. As Rachel moved on down the aisle, Samantha's eyes remained fixed on Max, her paranoia growing with each passing minute. Max had been trying to focus on his book, but the growing tension around him was hard to ignore. He wasn't oblivious. He could sense the unease coming from behind him. He had felt it before, in other spaces, in other settings. The quiet judgment, the suspicion, the way people's eyes lingered on him longer than they should. He kept his gaze fixed on the words in front of him, but his mind wandered. He thought about the conference in Los Angeles, the speech he had prepared about racial equality and justice. It felt ironic now, sitting here on a plane, being silently accused of something simply because of who he was. He glanced out the window, watching the clouds roll by. It wasn't the first time he had felt this way, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't going to let this situation get to him. He had too much experience with situations like this to let it throw him off balance. Behind him, he could hear soft murmurs. Samantha was whispering to her husband again, her voice tense and anxious. Max didn't need to hear the words to know what she was saying. He had heard it all before. The plane had leveled off at cruising altitude, and most of the passengers had settled into their in-flight routines. Some were watching movies, others dozing off. But not Samantha. She was still on edge, her mind racing with scenarios of danger. She watched as Max put his book down and reached into his bag again, this time pulling out a small pill bottle. Her heart pounded in her chest as she imagined the worst. What was he doing? Why did he keep checking that bag? "I'm telling you, he's hiding something," Samantha whispered fiercely to Ethan. "He's up to something." Ethan rubbed his forehead, clearly growing tired of the conversation. "And Sam, you've got to stop. You're working yourself up over nothing." But Samantha couldn't stop. Her anxiety was spiraling out of control, and she felt like the only person on the plane who was paying attention to the potential threat. She raised her hand again, signaling for Rachel, the flight attendant, to return. Rachel approached with the same calm smile as before. "Yes, ma'am? Is there something else I can help you with?" Samantha leaned in again, her voice urgent. "He keeps checking that bag. He just took something out of it, and I don't know what it was. I really think you should check it. What if it's dangerous?" Rachel glanced at Max again, her expression unreadable. "Ma'am, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot search another passenger's belongings without a specific reason to believe there's a threat. Everyone on this flight passed through security screening, and there hasn't been any cause for alarm." Samantha's frustration boiled over. "You're not taking this seriously. People like him, they act normal until they don't. I've seen it on the news. You can't just ignore it." Rachel maintained her professionalism, though her patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am, we take all passenger concerns seriously, but there's no evidence of anything wrong here. Please try to relax and enjoy the flight." Samantha huffed in frustration, crossing her arms. "You'll regret it if something happens." Rachel nodded politely, choosing not to engage further. As she walked away, she cast a quick glance at Max, who was now calmly reading his book again, completely unaware of the growing storm behind him. As the flight continued, Max remained immersed in his book, though his sense of calm was wearing thin. Despite his best efforts to ignore the tension simmering a few rows behind him, he couldn't fully shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The energy in the cabin had shifted. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, the prickling awareness of being watched. Samantha, on the other hand, was growing more restless by the minute. Every time Max moved, even if it was just to turn a page or shift in his seat, her heart raced with anxiety. She had convinced herself that something terrible was going to happen, and the flight attendants weren't taking her seriously. She wasn't being paranoid, she told herself. She was being vigilant. She was protecting everyone on board. Ethan, now exasperated, leaned closer to her. "Sam, you've got to stop this. You're working yourself up for nothing." Samantha shook her head, her jaw clenched. "You don't understand. No one does. That man is dangerous. I can feel it." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew there was no talking her down once she got like this. Her anxiety had taken hold, and nothing he could say would make a difference. But what worried him more was the reaction from the other passengers. Some were beginning to notice Samantha's fixation on Max, and a few had even glanced over in curiosity, their expressions growing uneasy as they picked up on the rising tension. Finally, Samantha made her decision. She wasn't going to sit by and let this happen. She couldn't. She raised her hand for Rachel again, but this time she didn't wait for the flight attendant to reach her. She stood up, her movements stiff with determination, and marched down the aisle toward Max's seat. Max sensed the shift in the air and looked up just as Samantha approached. Their eyes met for the first time, and Max saw something unsettling in her gaze. Something wild, panicked, and determined. "You," Samantha said, her voice sharp and loud enough for several passengers to hear. "I want to know what's in that bag. Right now." The cabin seemed to still for a moment. Passengers turned to look, their curiosity piqued by the sudden confrontation. Rachel, alarmed, hurried down the aisle, but she was too late to stop what was already happening. Max stared at Samantha, stunned by the intensity of her demand. He remained seated, his posture calm, but his eyes narrowed in confusion. "Excuse me?" "I said," Samantha repeated, louder this time. "I want to know what you're hiding in that bag. You've been acting suspicious since we boarded. I know you're up to something." Max blinked, taken aback by the accusation. For a split second, he didn't know how to respond. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, being accused, by a complete stranger, of hiding something dangerous. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think I'm doing, but I can assure you there's nothing dangerous in my bag. I'm just trying to have a peaceful flight like everyone else." Samantha shook her head, her voice trembling with frustration. "Don't lie to me. I've been watching you. You keep checking that bag like you're hiding something. I'm not going to sit here and wait for something to happen." Rachel finally reached them, stepping between Max and Samantha before things could escalate further. Her voice was firm but calm, the practiced tone of someone who had dealt with difficult passengers before. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat, please. We don't want to cause a scene." But Samantha wasn't backing down. "I'm not causing a scene. I'm trying to protect everyone on this plane. This man is hiding something, and you're all just ignoring it." Max remained seated, his hands resting on his knees, his face a mask of control. But inside, he felt the familiar anger building, the frustration of being judged and accused simply because of who he was, because of what he looked like. Rachel, sensing the growing tension in the cabin, glanced around. Other passengers were watching closely now, some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This had gone too far. "Sir?" Rachel said gently, turning to Max. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but would you mind showing us the contents of your bag? Just so we can put this to rest and continue the flight peacefully?" Max's jaw clenched. He didn't like being put in this position. He knew that complying would be the easiest way to end this confrontation, but it didn't sit right with him. He had already been judged, already been found guilty in this woman's eyes, and now he was expected to prove his innocence. But he also knew that refusing could make things worse. With a deep breath, he nodded. "Fine." Slowly, he unzipped his carry-on bag and lifted it onto his lap. He reached inside and pulled out his medication, pills for his heart condition, a book, a small water bottle, and a few other personal items. Nothing more. "There," Max said, his voice calm but edged with frustration. "That's everything. Nothing dangerous, as you can see." Rachel nodded, relieved, and gave Samantha a pointed look. "You see, ma'am, there's nothing to worry about. Please return to your seat." But Samantha wasn't convinced. She stared at the contents of Max's bag, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "No, no, that can't be everything. He's lying. He has to be." Rachel's patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down. We've inspected the bag. There's nothing here that poses a threat." Samantha shook her head again, her eyes wide with panic. "You're all blind. He's hiding something, and I'm not going to sit here and let this happen." Max remained quiet, though the anger was bubbling beneath the surface. He had shown them everything, and still, this woman wasn't satisfied. Still, she clung to her fear, to her prejudice, as if it were a lifeline. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Some were annoyed by the disturbance, while others seemed genuinely concerned, their eyes darting between Samantha and Max. The tension was thick now, palpable in the air. Ethan, who had been watching the scene unfold from his seat, finally stood and approached Samantha, gently grabbing her arm. "Sam, come on! You're making a scene. Let's sit down and let it go." But Samantha pulled away from him, her voice rising. "No, Ethan! You don't understand. I'm doing this for us, for everyone on this plane." Rachel, her voice still calm but firmer now, addressed Samantha again. "Ma'am, if you don't return to your seat, I'll have no choice but to involve the captain." Samantha hesitated, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their judgment weighing heavily. She didn't want to back down, didn't want to admit that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. But the pressure was too much. Slowly, reluctantly, she allowed Ethan to guide her back to her seat. Her mind, however, was still racing. She wasn't done. Not yet. As the tension in the cabin began to subside, Max closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a slow, controlled breath. He had dealt with this before. The quiet, simmering prejudice that people like Samantha carried with them. But it never got easier. He thought back to his work, to the countless cases he had fought in courtrooms across the country. He had seen the damage that fear and ignorance could do, how it could destroy lives, tear apart communities. And yet here he was, once again on the receiving end of that same ignorance. He wasn't angry at Samantha, not really. She was a product of her environment, of the world that had taught her to fear people who looked like him. But that didn't make it any less painful. He had shown her everything, had laid bare his personal belongings, his medication, his dignity, and still, it wasn't enough. Max opened his eyes, staring out the window at the clouds passing by. He wasn't going to let this ruin him. He wasn't going to let one person's fear define his experience. He had too much to do, too much to accomplish. There were people who needed him, people who relied on him to keep fighting for justice. And he wasn't about to let them down. Back in her seat, Samantha sat rigidly, her mind spinning. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How could everyone be so blind, so trusting? She was the only one who could see the danger, and yet no one was listening. She glanced around the cabin, noticing the way some passengers were still whispering, still casting occasional glances in her direction. They thought she was crazy, she realized. They thought she was overreacting. But Samantha knew better. She wasn't overreacting. She was the only one who truly understood the stakes. She had seen too many stories on the news about people slipping through security, about terrorists and criminals who seemed perfectly normal until it was too late. Her hands shook slightly as she crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. She wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't. She had to stay vigilant. Rachel returned to her duties, though her mind was still on the confrontation that had just taken place. She had been a flight attendant for years and had seen her fair share of difficult passengers. But something about this situation felt different. It wasn't just a case of a nervous flyer. It was deeper, more insidious. She knew that Max had done nothing wrong. He had been calm, polite, and cooperative throughout the entire ordeal. And yet, he had been forced to prove his innocence in front of everyone, simply because of one woman's irrational fear. As Rachel moved down the aisle, checking on passengers and offering drinks, she noticed that the mood in the cabin was still tense. Some passengers looked annoyed, while others appeared concerned. But what worried her most was the way Samantha was still watching Max. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Rachel had a gut feeling that this wasn't over. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin remained thick. Max tried to focus on his book, but it was impossible to concentrate. The confrontation with Samantha weighed heavily on his mind, replaying in fragments. Her words, her body language. It was all so familiar, yet still exhausting. No matter how many times Max had dealt with similar situations in his life, the emotional toll never got lighter. He shifted in his seat, looking out the window at the vast, serene sky. The world outside was peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the plane. He had always loved the solitude of flying, the hours of silence, high above the clouds, far removed from the ground below. But this flight had been anything but peaceful. Rachel, the flight attendant, passed by Max's seat, her expression soft but alert. She didn't say anything, but her quick, sympathetic glance told him she understood more than she let on. She was keeping an eye on Samantha, who was still sitting rigidly in her seat, her arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. Max felt another wave of frustration. Why did it always have to be like this? Why did he, as a black man, constantly have to prove his innocence, even when he had done nothing wrong? Even when his intentions were transparent and honest? And why did people like Samantha, wrapped in their own fears, hold so much power to disrupt others' lives? The plane began its slow descent toward Los Angeles. Max knew the flight was almost over, but something told him that the situation wasn't resolved. Samantha's intense gaze hadn't wavered, and the passengers around them were still unsettled. It was like waiting for a storm to break, but not knowing when or where the first strike would hit. Samantha sat in her seat, seething with frustration. No one was listening to her. Not Rachel, not Ethan, not the other passengers. They were all just ignoring the truth that was so painfully obvious to her. That man, Max, was dangerous. She was sure of it. But how could she make them see? Samantha clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She was the only one standing between them and whatever catastrophe was waiting to happen. And yet, they were treating her like she was the problem. Her thoughts raced, replaying every moment of the flight. She had seen the way Max had carefully checked his bag, the way he had tried to appear so calm, so normal. But Samantha knew better. He was hiding something, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Samantha glanced at Ethan, who was sitting beside her, pretending to read his magazine. She could see the exhaustion on his face, the way he was avoiding eye contact, hoping the situation would just blow over. But Samantha wasn't about to let it go. Not now. As the plane began its descent, her mind whirled with plans. She had already tried talking to the flight attendant, but that hadn't worked. The other passengers didn't seem interested in helping either. That left her with one option. She would have to take matters into her own hands. Rachel moved quietly through the aisle, her senses on high alert. The situation between Samantha and Max had calmed down for the moment. But Rachel had been a flight attendant long enough to know that tension like this didn't just dissipate. It simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right trigger to explode. She had kept an eye on Samantha throughout the rest of the flight, watching as the woman sat with a look of quiet determination on her face. Rachel wasn't sure what Samantha was planning, but the intensity in her expression worried her. Max, on the other hand, had been the picture of composure. He hadn't said another word since the incident, keeping to himself, reading his book, and occasionally staring out the window. But Rachel knew better than to assume that everything was fine. She had seen the way his jaw had tightened during the confrontation, the way his hands had gripped the armrests just a little too tightly. He was holding it all in, and that couldn't be easy. As Rachel passed by Max's seat, she gave him another quick, reassuring glance. She wanted him to know that she saw him, that she understood what he was going through, even if she couldn't say it out loud. Max gave her a small nod in return, appreciating the unspoken acknowledgement. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they would soon be landing in Los Angeles. Rachel took a deep breath, hoping the rest of the flight would go smoothly, but a part of her knew that something was still brewing. As the plane made its final approach, the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign rang out, and passengers began preparing for landing. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense but quiet, a lull that felt too fragile, too temporary. Suddenly, Samantha unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. The movement was so abrupt that it caught everyone's attention. Heads turned, and murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged confused glances. Rachel, who had been standing near the galley, immediately moved down the aisle, her heart racing. "Ma'am, please sit down," Rachel said firmly, trying to maintain control of the situation. "We're about to land. You need to remain seated with your seatbelt on." But Samantha wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on Max, who had also looked up, startled by her sudden movement. "I want to know what's in that bag," Samantha demanded, her voice rising. "I don't care what you showed us earlier. I know you're hiding something. And I'm not going to let this plane land until you tell the truth." Max blinked, stunned by the accusation. He had already shown her everything, had already proven that he was carrying nothing more than personal belongings. And yet here she was, still accusing him, still driven by a fear that had no basis in reality. The passengers around them began to murmur, some looking uncomfortable, others visibly annoyed. Rachel stepped between Samantha and Max, her voice firm but calm. "Ma'am, I'm asking you again to return to your seat. You're disturbing the other passengers, and we cannot allow this kind of behavior, especially during landing." Samantha shook her head, her voice trembling with frustration. "You don't understand. He's lying. I've been watching him the whole flight. He's been checking that bag over and over. He's hiding something dangerous, and none of you are taking this seriously." Max remained seated, his hands resting on his lap. He had done everything he could to de-escalate the situation, but he could feel the stares of the other passengers, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. It was infuriating, humiliating, and deeply unfair. But he knew that any reaction from him would only make things worse. "Ma'am," Rachel said, her tone more insistent now, "you need to sit down immediately, or I will have to involve the captain." Samantha glared at Rachel, but she could feel the pressure building. The flight attendants, the passengers, even Ethan. Everyone was watching her, waiting for her to back down. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Max, sensing that the situation was on the verge of spiraling out of control, finally spoke up. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "Ma'am, I've already shown you everything in my bag. There's nothing dangerous. Please sit down." But Samantha wasn't hearing him. Her mind was racing, her fear consuming her rational thoughts. She was convinced that Max was hiding something, that he was a threat to everyone on the plane. And if no one else was going to stop him, she would. Rachel took a step closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Ma'am, please. You're going to get yourself into trouble. Let us land safely, and if you still have concerns, We can address them once we're on the ground." Samantha hesitated, torn between her growing paranoia and the realization that she was rapidly losing support from those around her. Ethan, who had been silent throughout the entire confrontation, gently tugged at her sleeve. "Hey, Sam, please, just sit down." For a moment, it seemed like Samantha might relent. She looked at Ethan, then back at Max, her face a mask of frustration and fear. But instead of sitting down, she pointed a trembling finger at Max. "You can't fool me," she said, her voice wavering. "I know what you're doing." The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point. Passengers who had been quietly observing were now visibly anxious, shifting in their seats, some whispering to each other in concern. The plane was nearing its final descent, and everyone knew that this situation needed to end. Rachel, sensing that the captain might intervene at any moment, took one last step toward Samantha. Her voice was calm but laced with authority. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down right now, or I will have no choice but to restrain you. Please don't make this worse for yourself." Samantha stared at Rachel, her eyes wide with defiance. But something in Rachel's tone, something firm and unyielding, finally broke through the fog of her fear. Slowly, reluctantly, Samantha stepped back. Her shoulders slumped, and the fire in her eyes dimmed as she allowed Ethan to guide her back to her seat. The cabin was eerily silent as Rachel watched Samantha buckle her seatbelt. The other passengers held their breath, waiting for the situation to fully de-escalate. Max, still seated near the emergency exit, let out a quiet sigh of relief, though he knew the damage had already been done. Rachel gave Max a small nod, her expression apologetic but grateful that he had remained calm. "Thank you," she whispered before moving back to her station. As the plane touched down on the runway, the tension in the cabin remained thick. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eager to disembark and leave the unsettling situation behind. Samantha sat in silence, staring straight ahead, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. Max remained composed, though the emotional weight of the confrontation still lingered. He had done nothing wrong, but he felt the judgment of the passengers around him. He knew that their whispers, their glances, would stay with him long after the flight had ended. When the plane came to a stop at the gate, the seatbelt sign flicked off, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Rachel stood near the front of the cabin, directing people toward the exit, her face a mask of calm professionalism. But underneath, she was still rattled by what had happened. Max stayed seated, waiting for the rush of passengers to pass before he made his move. He didn't want to deal with the stares, the whispers. He just wanted to get off the plane and move on with his life. As the last of the passengers filed out, Rachel approached Max one final time. "Mr. Harper, I'm so sorry for everything that happened. If there's anything we can do—" Max shook his head, offering her a tired but understanding smile. "It's not your fault. Thank you for handling it as best as you could." Rachel nodded, grateful for his patience. "If you need any further assistance, just let us know." Max gathered his things and stood, the weight of the past few hours heavy on his shoulders. As he walked down the aisle, he glanced back one last time. Samantha was still seated, her eyes downcast, as if she were lost in her own thoughts. Max didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had survived the flight, but the impact of the confrontation would stay with him. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he took a deep breath, ready to leave it all behind. The Los Angeles airport was bustling with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to make their connections, families reuniting, and business people pulling rolling suitcases behind them. Max Harper stepped off the plane and into the terminal, his heart heavy. He stood still for a moment, letting the movement of the crowd flow around him like a river. The weight of the flight and everything that had transpired lingered in the air, as thick as the humidity outside. He hadn't said much after the incident. What was there to say? Max knew that no matter how many times he faced situations like the one with Samantha, they would always sting. The quiet judgments, the baseless suspicions, these weren't new to him, but each one felt like a cut that had yet to heal fully. Max pulled out his phone and saw a message from Lydia, his sister. Lydia, heard you landed. Everything okay? She knew him too well. Lydia had always been his confidant, the person who understood how these moments weighed on him even when he didn't speak about them. He typed a quick response. Max, landed. Talk later? Rough flight. Max sighed as he hit send. He wasn't sure what he would say when they spoke later. Part of him wanted to vent, to express the deep frustration and exhaustion that had built up over the years, while another part of him wanted to put the entire experience behind him and move on. As he made his way through the terminal, Max noticed other passengers from the flight glancing at him, their expressions a mix of awkwardness and guilt. Some offered weak smiles of acknowledgement, while others avoided eye contact entirely. Max understood that they didn't know how to act. They had witnessed the confrontation but hadn't intervened. Now they were left grappling with their silence, unsure whether to offer sympathy or pretend it hadn't happened at all. One of the passengers, a middle-aged man in a business suit, hesitated before approaching Max. Hey, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened back there, the man said, his voice low. That woman, she was out of line. Max looked at him for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He appreciated the sentiment, but it wasn't enough to erase the sting of the experience. Still, he nodded politely. Thanks, he said, keeping his tone neutral. The man gave him a weak smile before awkwardly stepping away. Max watched him go, feeling a surge of emotions he couldn't quite articulate. There were always apologies after the fact, always words of sympathy, but they didn't change what had happened. They didn't change the fact that once again he had been made to feel like an outsider, a threat, when all he had done was exist. Max shook off the thought as he made his way toward the baggage claim. He needed to refocus, to let go of the frustration for now. The conference was just a day away, and he had work to do. Important work that couldn't wait. Later that evening, after settling into his hotel, Max finally had time to breathe. The room was quiet, and the city lights outside his window provided a soft, ambient glow. He sat down on the bed and pulled out his phone, staring at the screen for a moment before dialing Lydia's number. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice filled with concern. Max, hey, I've been waiting to hear from you. What happened on that flight? You sounded off in your message. Max leaned back against the headboard, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. It was one of those flights, he said quietly. Some woman convinced herself that I was a threat. Thought I was hiding something in my bag. It turned into a whole scene. Lydia sighed deeply. Again? Yeah, again. I'm so sorry, Max. I can't believe people still act like this. It's infuriating. Max nodded, though she couldn't see him. I know. I'm tired, Liddy. Tired of always having to prove that I'm not what they think I am. I didn't do anything, and yet she was ready to believe I was dangerous just because of how I looked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Lydia's voice was softer when she finally spoke. You don't have to prove anything, Max. You know that, right? You've done enough. You are enough. People like her, they're trapped in their own fear. That's not your burden to carry. Max closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. He knew she was right, but it was hard not to carry that burden when he had lived with it his entire life. I know, he said after a moment, but it still weighs on me. I get it, Lydia said gently. I really do, but don't let this one woman's fear take away from who you are. You're stronger than that. You've spent your entire career fighting for justice, for people who don't have a voice. And you've done it with dignity. That's what matters. Max smiled faintly, the tension in his chest easing a little. Lydia had always been good at putting things into perspective. Thanks, Liddy. I needed to hear that. Any time, she said, her voice warm with affection. And don't forget, this conference is important. You've got people to inspire tomorrow. Don't let one bad experience cloud the work you've been doing. I won't, Max promised. I just needed to let it out. They talked for a few more minutes, catching up on family matters and lightening the mood. By the time they hung up, Max felt a little more centered, a little readier to move forward. The next morning, Max stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room, adjusting his tie and straightening his jacket. Today was the day he would speak at one of the most significant civil rights conferences in the country. He had prepared for this moment for months, crafting a speech that would touch on the progress made, the obstacles still ahead, and the resilience of those fighting for justice. As he looked at his reflection, Max thought back to the previous day's flight. The anger and frustration were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now they fueled him. He had a message to deliver, and this experience was a reminder of why his work was so necessary. People like Samantha, trapped in their fears and prejudices, were the reason he fought so hard for equality, for justice. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, for everyone who had been silenced by fear, and for everyone who had been forced to prove their worth in a world that didn't always see it. The conference hall was packed when Max arrived, filled with activists, lawyers, and community leaders from across the country. The energy in the room was electric, buzzing with hope and determination. Max could feel it, the collective will to make a difference, to push for change. When it was his turn to speak, Max stepped onto the stage, his heart steady. The spotlight shone on him, and for a moment he stood in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he began. He spoke of progress, of the victories won, but also of the work that remained. He talked about the power of resilience, the importance of standing up in the face of injustice, and the need to keep pushing forward, no matter how many times they were knocked down. And he spoke of his personal experiences, the moments when he had been judged not for who he was, but for what he looked like. I've had moments where I was reduced to a stereotype, moments when I was seen as a threat just because of the color of my skin, Max said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But those moments don't define me, and they don't define us. What defines us is how we rise above them. What defines us is our strength, our dignity, and our refusal to be silenced. The audience was silent, captivated by his words. As Max continued, he could see the impact his story was having. He could feel the connection between himself and the people in the room. People who understood. People who had lived through their own struggles and who were ready to keep fighting. When Max finished, the room erupted into applause. It was a standing ovation, one that lasted longer than he had expected. He stepped back from the podium, his heart full, knowing that his message had resonated. Later that evening, after the conference had ended, Max found himself standing outside, looking up at the stars. The night was calm, and the air was cool against his skin. He felt lighter, more at peace, as if the events of the past day had been lifted from his shoulders. He thought about Samantha, about her fear, her misguided accusations, and wondered if she had reflected on what had happened. He didn't hate her. He couldn't. But he hoped that one day she would see the world differently, that she would realize that her fear had been misplaced, that people like Max weren't threats, but allies in the fight for a better future. Max took a deep breath and smiled. He knew the road ahead was long, and there would be more challenges, more moments of frustration. But he also knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. There were people like Lydia, like the audience at the conference, like the countless individuals across the country who were working toward a world where people were judged by their character, not their appearance. As Max walked back to his hotel, his footsteps steady and his heart full, he felt a sense of purpose. The work wasn't finished, but he was ready to keep going. He was ready to keep fighting for justice, for equality, and for a future where no one had to prove their worth simply for being who they were. The flight had been difficult, but it was just one moment in a lifetime of moments that would continue to shape him, guide him, and strengthen his resolve. Max Harper wasn't defined by the fear of others. He was defined by his strength, his resilience, and his unwavering commitment to justice. And that was more than enough. The morning after the conference, Max Harper woke up feeling lighter than he had in days. His speech the previous evening had been met with overwhelming support, and the conversations that followed gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He had stayed up late answering questions, shaking hands, and hearing stories from others who had experienced similar struggles. For the first time since the flight, he felt a sense of closure. Max sat at the small desk in his hotel room, sipping his morning coffee as he scrolled through the news on his phone. There were articles about the conference, quotes from his speech, and praise for the way he had spoken about resilience and the fight for equality. As he read through the coverage, Max allowed himself a small smile. His words had resonated with people. The message he had carried with him from the courtroom to the conference stage was making an impact. But it wasn't just the attention from the media that had given him peace. It was the individual stories he had heard from people after his speech. The young lawyer who had just started in civil rights, the activist who had faced a lifetime of prejudice, the teacher who had dedicated her career to educating children about equality. Max had always known that his work mattered, but seeing the ripple effect in others made it all the more meaningful. He couldn't help but think back to the flight, to the way Samantha's fear had shaken him, if only briefly. But now, the event seemed like a distant memory, something that had tested him but failed to break him. As he prepared to check out of the hotel and head to the airport for his return flight to New York, Max received a text from his sister. "Lydia, so proud of you. Saw clips of your speech this morning. You're making a difference, Max. Just remember that." He smiled and texted back, "Max, thanks, Liddy. Heading home today. I'll see you soon." As Max boarded his return flight to New York, he felt a sense of déjà vu. The airport was just as busy as it had been on his flight out. The same hum of travelers, the same rush to get to the gate. But this time, the weight of anxiety and suspicion didn't hang in the air. Max found his seat, stowed his carry-on, and settled in for the flight. He pulled out the book he had tried to read during his flight to Los Angeles, hoping for a more peaceful experience this time around. He noticed a couple sitting across the aisle from him, a woman and a man, chatting quietly as they flipped through a travel guide. They looked relaxed, engaged in their conversation about sightseeing in New York. The woman caught Max's eye briefly and smiled. Max smiled back, a silent exchange that was simple and unburdened by fear or suspicion. The small moment was a reminder of how things should be, how easy it could be for people to connect, without prejudice clouding their perception of one another. Max settled into his seat and opened his book, feeling the calm wash over him as the plane took off. The flight was quiet, uneventful, and peaceful, just what Max had hoped for. As he read, his mind wandered back to the stories he had heard at the conference, to the people who had shared their struggles and triumphs. Each story, each person, had reinforced the idea that progress was possible, even if it was slow. Max reflected on the importance of the work he was doing and the responsibility that came with it. He had been given a platform, and he intended to use it wisely, to continue fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and to keep pushing for a world where everyone was seen for who they truly were, not for the color of their skin or the fears of others. The plane landed smoothly at JFK, and Max disembarked with a renewed sense of purpose. As he stepped into the terminal, the familiar sounds of the city greeted him. New York was home, and despite its flaws, it was the place where Max felt most at ease. Waiting for him at the arrivals gate was Lydia, her face breaking into a wide smile as soon as she saw him. She waved and hurried over to greet him. "Hey, big brother," she said, wrapping him in a warm hug. Max smiled, hugging her back. "Hey, Lyd, it's good to be home." Lydia pulled back, her eyes twinkling with pride. "I watched your whole speech online. You were incredible. People were talking about it all over social media today." Max chuckled, feeling a little embarrassed. "Yeah, I saw. I'm just glad it resonated with people." "Are you kidding? You moved people. You got them thinking. That's what it's all about." Max nodded, appreciating her words. They walked toward the baggage claim together, and as they waited for his suitcase, Lydia turned to him, her expression more serious. "Have you heard anything more from the airline? About what happened with that woman?" Max shook his head. "No, and I'm not expecting to. I just want to move on from it. I've got more important things to focus on." Lydia nodded, understanding. "I get it. But don't let it stop you from speaking out about it. There are people out there who need to hear your story. It's not just about you, it's about all the people who go through this every day." Max looked at her, his sister's words sinking in. She was right, of course. He hadn't spoken much about what had happened on the flight, but maybe it was time. Maybe sharing his story could help others see what he had seen, how easily fear could turn into suspicion, and how damaging that could be. "I will," Max promised. "I'll speak about it when the time's right. But for now, I just want to focus on what's ahead." Lydia smiled, satisfied with his answer. "Good. Now, let's get you home. Mom's making dinner, and you know she's going to want to hear all about the conference." Max laughed, feeling the warmth of family and home wrap around him. As they headed out of the terminal, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He was ready to move forward, to keep fighting for justice, to keep speaking out, and to keep making a difference. A few weeks later, Max found himself back in the courtroom, working on a case that had garnered national attention. It was a high-profile civil rights case, one that could set a major precedent for future lawsuits involving police misconduct. Max was fully immersed in his work, and yet the experience on the plane still lingered in the back of his mind. One afternoon, as he was preparing for the next day's trial, Max received an unexpected email from the airline. It was a formal apology letter, acknowledging what had happened on the flight from New York to Los Angeles. The airline expressed regret for the distress caused by the incident and promised to review its policies to ensure that passengers would be treated with respect, regardless of appearance. Max read the email carefully, feeling a mixture of emotions. On one hand, it was a small victory, an acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't right. On the other hand, it felt like too little, too late. Apologies were easy, but real change required more than just words. Still, Max appreciated the gesture. He replied with a brief "thank you," then closed his laptop and sat back in his chair. He knew that this was just one step in a much larger fight. There would always be more to do, more battles to fight, and more voices to amplify. But for now, he was content to keep moving forward. Every small step mattered. Every voice that spoke out against injustice made a difference. Max was ready for whatever came next. Months passed, and Max continued to balance his work as a civil rights lawyer with his public speaking engagements. The incident on the plane became a part of his story, one that he shared carefully, using it to illustrate the broader issues of prejudice and fear that still plagued society. It wasn't about vilifying Samantha or seeking retribution. It was about helping people understand how these moments of fear and suspicion could ripple out, affecting more than just the individuals involved. Max's story resonated with people. It opened up conversations, sparked debates, and inspired others to examine their own biases. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And with each speaking engagement, each case won, Max felt a little more hope for the future. One evening, after a particularly moving event where he had spoken to a group of young activists, Max sat in his office, reflecting on how far he had come. He thought about his journey, about the challenges, the triumphs, and the moments that had shaped him. And he thought about the future, about the world he wanted to help create, where fear and prejudice no longer dictated how people were treated. Max smiled to himself, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The work was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had faced fear, he had faced judgment, and he had risen above it all. As he closed his laptop and prepared to head home for the night, Max knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice was long, but it was worth every step, and he wasn't walking that path alone. Thanks for joining me on this journey with Max's story. If you found the message of resilience, justice, and overcoming adversity powerful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more stories that inspire, challenge, and make you think. And hey, don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, we can keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching.